Hello, guys. Welcome to Neurophysiology. I'm Charles, your uncle and facilitator for this course. I'm reaching you live from PHCT in River State, Nigeria. It's Module 5, and our topic today is spinal reflexes. Alright, overview. I'll make a brief introduction, and then we'll look at the reflex arc, followed by the muscle spindle, and then we'll look at the types of spinal reflexes. Alright, fantastic. Introduction. A reflex is a response to a stimulus. Alright, good. Reflex arc are the structural and functional unit of all reflex activity. Reflex activities are involuntary activities. Alright, fantastic. There are 7 major components of a reflex arc. Okay, the first component is known as the stimulus. So all reflex activity begins with a stimulus. The second component of the reflex arc is the receptor. Alright, the third component of the reflex arc is known as the afferent pathway. So number 3 is the afferent pathway. The fourth component of a reflex arc is the integrating center. Alright, the fifth component of a reflex arc is known as what? The efferent pathway. Very simple. The sixth one is the effector organ, and then the last one is a response. Number 7. These constitutes the 7 major components of a reflex arc. Alright, fantastic. Going forward. Alright, activities in a reflex arc begins with a stimulus. Alright, this is the stimulus. Look at this diagram here. You can see a nail piercing the skin. The piercing of this sharp object is the stimulus. Alright, now the stimulus would stimulate the receptor, which is also known as the sense organ. This is the receptor. Alright, there are receptors here that are stimulated by the piercing of this nail. And what does this do? Once the receptors are stimulated, it will eventually stimulate the afferent neuron. The afferent neuron is this part here. It carries this information to the integrating center. Alright, so stimulation of the afferent neuron would carry the information to the integrating center. The integrating center is made up by either the brain or the spinal cord. Alright, here the integrating center is the spinal cord. Okay, so the spinal cord processes the information and sends it down to the afferent neuron. Okay, now what happens? The afferent neuron, upon receiving the processed information from the center, would now send back motor commands to the effector organ. So here is the efferent neuron sending the motor commands from the integrating center, which is the spinal cord, to the effector organ. The effector organ here is the muscle. Alright, the effector organ will now finally respond to the motor command, either by way of contraction or relaxation, or by secreting its contents. Alright, if that effector organ was a gland. Now, this is how the reflex arc works. Alright, fantastic. Going forward, we shall now look at the muscle spindle. This diagram here explains everything about the muscle spindle. Alright, good. Now, each skeletal muscle fiber is made up of special cells. These are special cells, alright, found in each skeletal muscle fiber, and these cells are known as the muscle spindle. So what are muscle spindles? Muscle spindles are specialized cells that are found in skeletal muscles. Alright, the muscle spindles are also referred to as the sense organs or the receptors of the stretch reflex. Okay, we shall look at stretch reflex in details today. all right, in this lecture. Okay, good. Now, functionally, muscle spindles help to dictate changes in muscle length and tension. All right, these are their specific functions. So whenever your muscles are overstretched, all right, the muscle spindle helps to dictate the length and the tension of muscles. Okay, fantastic. There are actually two main parts of muscle spindles. The first part is known as the extrafusal fiber. All right, the second part is known as the intrafusal fiber. Okay, this area here represents the extrafusal fiber. All right, okay, it's also written here extrafusal fiber, extrafusal fiber, whereas this area represents the intrafusal fibers. The extrafusal fibers and intrafusal fibers are the two major components of muscle spindles. All right, fantastic. Now we shall look at the extrafusal fibers in details. All right, good. Now, the extrafusal fibers actually forms the bulk or the majority of the muscle spindles. Okay, so this part represents the extrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle. The whole of this area represents the extrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle. So they form the majority or the bulk of the muscle spindles. All right, fantastic. Now, the efferent nerve or connection of the muscle spindle is known as the alpha motor neuron. So this is the alpha motor neuron. All right, it is supplying the whole of the extrafusal fibers of the muscle spindles. Okay, fantastic. Now, stimulation of this neuron, that is the alpha motor neuron, causes contraction of the extrafusal fiber. Okay, so whenever this neuron is stimulated, there is contraction of the whole of the extrafusal muscle fibers of the muscle spindle. All right, now the intrafusal fiber forms the minority of the muscle spindle. This area represents the intrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle. All right, it is enclosed by a capsule. Okay, there are two main parts of the intrafusal fiber. The first one is known as the nuclear bag, and the other one is known as the nuclear chain fiber. This area here represents the nuclear bag of the intrafusal fiber, whereas this area represents the nuclear chain of the intrafusal fiber. These are the two major components of the intrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle. They are well labeled here. This is the nuclear bag. All right, if it's not clear, let me make it clearer for you to understand. This part represents the nuclear bag of the intrafusal fiber of the muscle spindle, whereas this area here represents what? The nuclear chain of the muscle spindle. All right, fantastic. Going forward. Now, both the nuclear bag and the nuclear chain components of the intrafusal muscle fibers are enclosed within a capsule. I said that in the previous slide. All right, now this diagram here represents the nuclear bag and the nuclear chain components of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Diagram A represents the nuclear bag components, while diagram B represents the nuclear chain components of the intrafusal muscle fiber. All right, good. Now, the nuclear bag actually has a dilation in the middle. All right, so if you examine these two diagrams, you would find out that the nuclear bag actually has a dilation around the central area. Okay, and it is also thicker than the nuclear chain component of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Again, there are numerous nuclei within or inside the nuclear bag components of the intrafusal muscle fibers. Going forward, the nuclear chain components of the intrafusal muscle fiber represents this portion here. That is diagram B. Comparing diagram B, that is nuclear chain, to the nuclear bag component of this muscle fiber, you find out that this component or the nuclear chain fiber is thinner and it does not have any dilations around the central area. Okay, so there are no dilations, it is not dilated. Secondly, it has very few nucleus within it. Okay, all right. Now, the efferent nerves supplying the intrafusal muscle fibers are the IA and the II group of nerve fibers, also known as the primary efferent nerve fiber and the secondary efferent nerve supply to the intrafusal muscle fiber. All right, as you can see from the diagram, the primary efferent supplies both the nuclear bag component and the nuclear chain components of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Same thing with the secondary efferent nerve fiber. All right, fantastic. Going forward, the efferent nerve supply to the intrafusal muscle fiber are the gamma motor neuron. All right, good. The gamma motor neuron is this one here. This is the gamma efferent or motor nerve to the intrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, as you can see, it supplies both components of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Remember that the alpha efferent nerve supplies the extrafusal muscle fiber. That's the whole of this part here. Okay, now you must know the afferent nerves supplying the intrafusal muscle fiber and the extrafusal muscle fiber. You must also know the efferents. These are very, very important. Okay, going forward. Now, the stimulation of the gamma motor neuron would ultimately cause contraction of the intrafusal muscle fiber. So when this nerve supply to the intrafusal muscle fibers are stimulated electrically, the intrafusal muscle fiber contracts. All right, so that is very, very interesting and simple to understand. Okay, going forward. Now, functionally, the intrafusal muscle fiber causes or dictates changes in muscle length. All right, now the component of the intrafusal muscle fiber responsible for this is the nuclear bag component of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, that is called dynamic response. Changes in muscle length is called dynamic response. All right, fantastic. Now, it also dictates changes in muscle tension. Okay, good. Now, the nuclear chain component of the intrafusal muscle fiber, that is this fiber here, is solely responsible for detecting changes in muscle tension, and this is known as static response. Changes in muscle tension is known as static response. All right, good. You know that when your muscle contracts, the muscle length changes, it shortens. All right, now the tension, all right, may either increase or decrease. You will do all of that in excitable tissues, muscle physiology. All right, I'm going to take my time to explain all of that. Okay, fantastic. Going forward, good. We shall now look at the types of spinal reflexes. Okay, there are two major types of spinal reflexes. The first one is known as monosynaptic reflex, while the second one is known as polysynaptic reflex. All right, good. Now, the monosynaptic reflex or reflexes are reflexes that has just a single synapse between the afferent and the efferent neuron. There are two types of monosynaptic reflexes. The first one is known as the stretch reflex, and the second one is known as the inverse stretch reflex. Inverse stretch reflex is the opposite of stretch reflex. We shall look at all of these in this class. A polysynaptic reflex is one with two or more synapses between the afferent and the efferent neurons. All right, okay. Monosynaptic, polysynaptic. Remember that names have meaning. Mono simply means single, one. Poly means two or more. Examples of polysynaptic reflex is the flexor reflex and extensor reflex. They are together or collectively known as the withdrawal reflex. We shall look at all of these reflexes in this discussion or class. Now, we want to look at stretch reflex in details. All right, the stretch reflex is also known as the myotatic reflex or reflexes. Now, what is stretch reflex? Good. A stretch reflex is one that causes muscle contraction in response to stretching of the muscle. All right, so whenever the muscles are stretched, stretch reflexes are activated. So this reflex will always cause the muscles to contract whenever it is stretched. It is an automatic response to stretching of the muscles. All right, and it has a physiological significance. Okay, going forward, stretch reflex actually helps to control muscle length. Okay, 2, it helps to prevent damage or tearing of a muscle. This is very important. Whenever the muscles are stretched, without the stretch reflex or reflexes, the muscles will be damaged. All right, so what happens if your muscles are stretched? These reflexes are stimulated, which will now cause that muscle to contract, and the contraction of that muscle actually helps to prevent that muscles from tearing. Otherwise, our muscles will be damaged whenever they are stretched without the stretch reflex. Thirdly, and most importantly, stretch reflex helps us to overcome gravity. I was saying when I started this course that reflexes are very, very important because they enable us to overcome gravity. Gravity is the downward pull of an object towards the center of the earth. You see, gravity or the gravitational force always wants to keep us down. Whenever a person is overpowered by the gravitational force, you just remain on the ground. And without biological reflexes, we will not be able to overcome gravity or gravitational force or the effect of gravitational force on us. All right, I give you a very clear example. Let's assume that Abasiakara was in class, all right, my class, and she was overpowered by gravitational force. You know what that does to her? She would begin to sleep. Whenever you are in class and you are overpowered by the force of gravity, you begin to sleep. This is the reason why some students sleep in class. Okay, good. Now, Abasiakara was listening to my lecture, and before you know it, she started doing like this. Good. Now, the force of gravity, as at that point, has acted on the back of her neck muscles, causing it to bend. Gravity will always want it to bend. Will bend you and bring you down to the ground. That is what gravity does. From nodding her head like that, the force of gravity would act on her back muscles, causing it to bend. In fact, the next thing Abasiakara would do is to move from nodding her head to lying down on her decks. Okay, and she begins to sleep. The same force of gravity upon acting on her would make her to actually look for a place to finally lie down, a bed. If care is not taken, she could even lie down on top of her decks and sleep. That is what gravitational force does to us. All right, so reflexes actually helps us to overcome gravity. Overcoming gravity is one important function of biological reflexes. All right, so I have said that reflexes here helps us to control muscle length. They also help us to prevent our muscles from damaging, and they help us to overcome or overpower gravitational force. Okay, fantastic. Now, there are several components of the stretch reflex. Okay, The first component is known as the test. The second component is known as the stimulus. The third component is known as the sense organ, also known as the receptor. The fourth component is the afferent. The fifth component here is the integrating center. The sixth component is the afferent neuron. The other word is the effector, and the last one is the response. These are the components of the stretch reflex. Alright, fantastic. This diagram here summarizes the stretch reflex. Alright, we have step 1, step 2, down to step 5. Now, in step 1, stretching of the muscle stimulates the muscle spindle. This is the muscle spindle. Are you getting me? Now, when the muscle is stretched, the muscle spindles are stimulated. Remember, the muscle spindle are the receptor organs or the sense organ of the skeletal muscle. Now, the stretching of the muscle spindle will actually activate the afferent neuron. This is step 2, showing activation of the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron here is the afferent neuron. Alright, that information is carried from the muscle spindle down to the integrating center. The integrating center here is the spinal cord, and information gets to the integrating center through the what? The afferent neuron. Alright, good. Now, the integrating center processes that information, alright, and sends down motor commands to the effector organ. The effector organ here is still the skeletal muscle, and the information or the motor commands are sent from the integrating center to the effector organ via the motor neuron. We shall look at stretch reflex in details. Alright, so in this slide we want to look at the stretch reflex of the bicep muscle. Alright, good. This is the bicep muscle of Princess Jessica. Let's look at the stretch reflex occurring here. Now, the test for the stretch reflex of Jessica's biceps muscle is the flexion of the arm. I hope you remember your anatomy. Now, if you're talking of flexing the arm is stretched forward like this way. Alright, this is flexion of the arm, and then when the arm is this way, it is what? Extension of the arm. If you stretch your arm, you are flexing the arm. If you move it backward this way, you are doing what? Extending it. So this is extension of the arm, and this is flexion of the arm. When Jessica's arm is fully flexed and you get a patellar hammer and tap the bicep tendon, alright, that would automatically lead to extension of the arm. Okay, alright, now the test for the stretch reflex of the bicep muscle is flexing of the arm and tapping the bicep tendon with a patellar hammer. Alright, this is how we test for stretch reflex of the bicep muscle in the laboratory. Okay, fantastic. Now, the stimulus here is actually stretch of the biceps muscle. So when the biceps muscle is stretched, that stretching of the biceps muscle represents the stimulus. Okay, fantastic. Now, the sense organ or the receptor for the stretch reflex of the biceps muscle is the muscle spindle. Alright, a diagram here shows us the muscle spindle. Okay, this is the muscle spindle. Alright, and it represents the sense organ or the receptor of the stretch reflex of the biceps muscle. Alright, going forward. Now, the afferent nerve fibers are the IA and the II group of nerve fiber. Alright, these blue nerve fibers here represents the afferent neuron. The afferent neuron is also known as the sensory neuron. So the afferent neuron for the stretch reflex of biceps muscle are the IE and the II group of nerve fibers. Alright, this one here. Good. Going forward, the center is formed by the spinal cord. So the center for the stretch reflex of the biceps muscle is the spinal cord. Alright, Jessica's spinal cord. Good. Now the efferent neurons are the alpha and the gamma motor neurons. Good. This neuron here represents the alpha motor neuron. Alright, it is written down here, alpha motor neuron. Okay, whereas this one here represents the gamma motor neuron. Alright, both the alpha and the gamma motor neuron constitutes the efferent neuron of the stretch reflex of the biceps muscle. Hope that is clear. Fantastic. Now, the effectors here are the biceps muscle and the triceps muscle. The biceps muscle is the one in front of your arm, while the triceps is the one behind your arm. All right, I hope you did that in your anatomy. Good. Now, the response of the stretch reflex of the biceps muscle is contraction of the biceps muscle. This muscle here contracts while the one behind relaxes. So the response are contraction of biceps muscles and relaxation of the triceps muscle. All right, fantastic. Now, when Jessica's bicep muscles are stretched, all right, the sense organs, which are the muscle spindles, are stimulated. Okay, the stimulation or activation of the muscle spindles would cause activation of the afferent neurons, which are the IA and the II group of nerve fibers. All right, the afferent neurons now carries this information to the integrating center. The integrating center here represents the spinal cord. Okay, the integrating center processes this information and then sends down motor commands through the efferent neurons, which are the alpha and the gamma motor neurons. All right, these efferent neurons carries the motor command back to the effector organ, that is back to the muscles. Okay, good. When the information gets back to the muscles, it causes a response, which are contraction of the bicep muscles and relaxation of the triceps muscle. When the muscle contracts, it is prevented from being further stretched. Now, this inhibition of the biceps muscle from further stretch prevents the bicep muscles from being damaged or torn. Okay, good. That is the essence of all of this. All right, good. There is what is known as reciprocal innervation.